All right, welcome everybody to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Tuesday, April 25th, and we're here this afternoon picking up our work on S-17. And so got Legislative Council here. So Tim, would you take us through some of the changes? I believe we're looking at draft 2.2.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much for having me, Chair McCarthy. Again, for the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Before you, you will have draft 2.2, which is a committee strike all amendment to the Senate Bill number 17, an act relating to sheriff's reforms. The differences between the last iteration of this strike all amendment that the committee reviewed and this one have been highlighted just for ease of reference. The first update proposed is on page 2. And this is under section 2, under the bill part pertaining to audits. And the highlighted text here is substantively the same as what was last proposed. But this now breaks up the previously proposed language for the sake of readability and clarity for the most part. But the substance of it should look, for the most part, very much the same. Happy to read through this as it now presents, Chair McCarthy, if you'd like, or would you like me to just kind of continue on?
Yeah, so why don't we just take a quick look through here. So we're basically separating the co-signing requirement from the having a written transition plan for clarity, right?
Yes, yeah, it was one kind of continuous sentence before, and we've just kind of broken that up. So, and perhaps I'll just read it. Okay. Subsection D, new subdivision 1, will read, upon the election of a sheriff-elect who is not the incumbent sheriff, an announcement that the incumbent sheriff will not seek re-election, or an announcement that the incumbent sheriff intends to resign, whichever occurs first, all financial disbursements from the accounts of the department, including the transfer of real or personal property or other assets of the department, shall be co-signed by the sheriff and the assistant judge. The sheriff shall provide a written transition plan to the assistant judge detailing all anticipated disbursements or transfers of departmental assets. Assistant judges shall consult with the department's staff and sheriff's executive committee prior to co-signing any disbursements or transfer of sheriff's department assets. New subdivision 2, an assistant judge shall forward the sheriff's written transition plan and a report of all financial disbursements and transfers made pursuant to the subsection to the auditor of accounts within 15 days of the following, 15 days following the sheriff leaving office. I'll pause there.
Representative Hickley.
Thank you. The only question I've got, I guess, is there was a concern around a sheriff that was elected, and from the period of time that they were elected to the period of time that they took office, this section really doesn't include any of that concern around what the existing elected sheriff can do in that interim time. And I'm wondering if where that might be addressed or if it should be addressed. I think, Senator Norris talked about it in particular, as far as from the time that he was elected to the time that he took office. There's a period of time there that is.
So we may not have totally addressed it, but what it's trying to do is at least provide so from the time that even before there's so starting from the time when the sitting sheriff says, I'm not running, that the earliest time, so we're bringing that time way up, that there's more transparency. So they have to have a transition plan. There's this co-signing with the side judges. The Sheriff's Association had asked us to add this in consultation with the Sheriff's Executive Committee and the department so that a side judge who may not be able to really evaluate those things would have that check. But I guess that I throw it back and say, is there an additional layer of accountability or clarity that you want to have beyond what's envisioned here with the kind of co-signing once we know a sheriff's going to be transitioning out?
Well, again, I don't want to complicate things, and I guess it'd be good to hear from, the sheriffs in particular.
Yeah, because this is an attempt to kind of massage the language that the Senate had, so, and then that the Department of the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs had recommended, building on that a little bit. And so now I'm wondering if we've gone too far with the Frankensteining by trying to satisfy everyone's concerns where it's not clear enough. Representative Morgan.
Yeah, just real quick. So it's sort of on that vein of thought. Is number two, I'll just be blunt, is it sort of an addressing of what occurred at the end of the tenure of the last tenure of the Caledonia Sheriff's Department? Am I misreading into this? In other words, if they were going to do an exit disbursement like was done, we found it was all completely legal and above board, obviously. But is that an attempt to address some of that? Is that what we're trying to do here? Because we're using under number two, we say of all financial disbursements and transfers. Was that the intent?
Yeah, I think what we're just trying to do is whether it's that situation or the kind of situation that former Sheriff Senator Norris talked about. He'll always be Sheriff Norris to me. Because
oh, yeah, sure.
When I was growing up, that was his title. So what he was saying was, he showed up at an office that all the assets had been spent down and some cars had been sold. And, so we're trying to basically be like, okay, when we know that a sheriff is exiting, there needs to be this increased layer of checks and balances.
Disclosure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's what I'm just asking. Yeah, I just want to see if that was part of that intent. Okay. Thank you.
And Representative Hooper.
But is there anything there to protect the other side of the equation where the judge basically says, I'm not going to do anything until the new sheriff comes?
So what we were trying to do here by having the consultation with the Sheriff's Executive Committee and the department is to add that a little bit more. So there's sort of the watcher of the watcher problem here that we have where we're expanding out the checks and balances. But I'm wondering, I don't want to hold Tim too long, and I do want to get through this, but I believe potentially Sheriff Eric Anderson may be able to help us out here.
The record, Mark Anderson, Wyndham County Sheriff and President of Vermont Sheriff's Association. I believe our testimony, and I might not have communicated it clearly, but was to say the executive committee could be like an appeal authority. So let's say that we run into the situation that Representative Hooper saying, the assistant judge says, I'm just not going to sign it. It can be an appeal saying this is an authorized expense. You don't need snowmobiles to operate your sheriff's department. You do need cars. So if an assistant judge says they don't feel comfortable responding to a sheriff's request to sell the snowmobiles, the association, or I'm sorry, the executive committee would be able to reflect that this is an appropriate expense, and they're generally the ones who are going to be remaining and dealing with any issues if they were to happen again, if this legislation failed to satisfy all the possibilities.
Okay.
I hear that, but I don't read that.
We did not go as far as the Sheriff's Association recommended. So let's put a pin in that for now, and we'll come back to this section because I'm hearing from the committee we haven't quite nailed it yet.
No, I agree.
The next part of this that has changed can be found, let's see, on page 6. And we'll transition now to the part of the strike all amendment pertaining to Sheriff's Department compensation and benefits. This is in section 5. The subsection C, you can see that last highlighted 2 sentences there. Really, this pertains again to that 5% we've been talking about at length. This has been rewritten to clarify that funds derived from charges for administration of the contract may be used for any purpose. If used for compensation-related items, then they must follow the model policy that's to be drafted by DSAS. Also, just want to quickly note that second sentence was moved up, but what did exist in the prior proposed reference to, that's the category B conduct right there, that will failure to comply with this policy shall constitute category B conduct pursuant to 20 VSA 2401 subsection 2. The Next part of the bill that is changed, we'll see on top of page 8. This is under section B5, Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And this removes the provision for the deputy, that proposed new position here, deputy, to create a model policy. Instead, the deputy director of sheriff shall instead assist each sheriff's department in maintaining compliance with the sheriff's department's compensation and benefits model policy. The next change will appear at the bottom of page 9, breaking into page 10. And this pertains to sheriff's duties. In particular, this will essentially add back an affirmative duty for sheriffs to provide assistance for domestic violence survivors to retrieve their personal belongings from that individual's residence, and also will prohibit a sheriff's department from seeking a fee for compensation providing that service.
So Tim, what I had asked after getting some feedback from the network and others was that what we don't want to do is say that sheriffs are the exclusive providers of this standby service. Because then we're basically saying that all the law enforcement agencies across the state that aren't sheriffs who do this work, well, they're done. You call the sheriff if you need standby service. And that just isn't practical unless we're going to, have a completely different way that we're approaching this. So what we're trying to get at here is that we shouldn't be charging the survivors for this service, but that we don't want to put all of the provision of this service exclusively on the sheriffs. And so trying to thread that needle here.
And I should,
go ahead. Yeah.
So I should just add the nuance that this shall kind of duty here is really triggered by a request for such service. That's an important piece that wasn't there before. Just want to mention that.
And we will take some testimony on this piece, again, trying to satisfy multiple different stakeholders' feedback over the weekend, and we may not have landed in a perfect spot yet.
And the last update you'll find on page 10 as well. Section 7A, Sheriff's Deputy Provision of Courthouse Security, semicolon report. And essentially what this does is now we'll have the judiciary to be reporting on the provision of law enforcement and security services to county and state courthouses. Before, it was the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And that is all the updates from the last version.
Tim, I'm sure after our testimony this afternoon, we will probably have some more work for you, but I will relinquish you to Senate Gov Ops for now. Thank you very much. So I would like to invite Terry to come up. If you want to come up as a team, always.
I think if that's okay. Terry Corsone, State Court Administrator, and Greg Mosley, who's Chief of Finance and Administration, definitely has a much better grasp on budget details. So we thought it'd be efficient to have him join us.
Well, welcome to both of you. And I specifically asked for your office's feedback on how to approach the requests that we had heard around how do we provide consistent courthouse security. And so we've looked at this issue a couple of times in the context of reviewing the budget requests. And now the idea that potentially we can move toward having all of the courthouse security provided by deputies who are similarly state employees, as is done with the transport deputies, has been put on the table by several folks. And so I wanted to get feedback on that particular issue from the courts.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity and also all the time and effort that you've dedicated to court security considerations. We're so appreciative. And I guess in terms of the most recent version of S-17, which we haven't had a chance to look at today, there are 3 sections that pertain to the judiciary, in particular in courthouse security. The first, in Section 5, talks about the single contractual rate of pay, which we support and we appreciate that being inserted. The second has to do with providing a minimum of 1 sheriff deputy per courthouse. There are 23 state and county courthouses throughout the state, with an effective date of July 1, 2024, in recognition of the workforce challenges that the sheriff's offices have in terms of meeting that a minimum by July 1 of this year. And then the new provision, Section 7A, that has to do with this report, that we think is a phenomenal opportunity to be able to really study and analyze what would be the best approach in terms of, I think I'd explained last time, historically it was always sheriff's deputies that provided all the courthouse security. Now it's a combination of different factors, and in light of those workforce challenges, figuring out what's the best way to ensure that we can meet and fulfill our responsibility to maintain courthouse security in Vermont. So we really appreciate the report and being able to do it in consultation with the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs, and certainly also with other relevant stakeholders, such as court staff, personnel, and others, to make sure we have as full a picture as possible. We would ask, there's been one other change with it that talks about at the end, creation of classified positions responsible for courthouse security services, similar to the classified position of transport deputy. And that it well may be that state paid deputies would be the model that would work the best and should fit into whatever the report's recommendations are. But we thought with the language, it almost is concluding that that's the case. So we didn't know, instead of saying similar to, you might say such as the classified position of transport deputy. And we've also talked about with Sheriff Anderson and also with Vince Aluzzi and Steve Howard just before coming in here, how a model of state paid deputies may well work. But Greg has, based on his experience with the budget, I guess a recommendation in terms of how that possibly might work so that we can maintain proper control over the budget, over the actual security and scheduling, et cetera.
So right now we have about 73 FDPs that provide court security. That's a mix of sheriff deputies, about 40 of them, along with 10 security, private security guards. Then we have about 23 employees. There's 23 different courthouses. They're all very, very different. So it's a little bit of a patched together idea. And we clearly understand and want law enforcement under the courthouse roof all the time. That is something that's important to us. We have a few situations where that's not the case, and there are issues and gaps. So it is definitely ideal for us to have a law enforcement officer in each courthouse when it's open. In terms of the study and models, there are a lot of different models that can be used. We have access to the National Center for State Courts that has best practices for court security, and we also have relationships with our other judiciary partners, the other 50 states that all have some sort of model put together. We can certainly do a lot of research and pull together the pros and cons of some of those different models. The one thing that we would be concerned about is, as Terry mentioned, is a language that kind of suggests a solution before the study actually gets going, like a position of some kind, or that particular model is the way that we're doing it. So we're open to changing up the structure because it has been a management effort for many years. So we see it headed in the right direction, and we look forward to working with a number of partners to put our best thoughts on it.
One idea would be, if there were state paid deputy model, though, that it be under the purview of the judiciary and our ability to control the budget and the supervision and the scheduling. So that would mean having it versus under the purview of the Department of Sheriffs and state's attorneys, that it be basically within the judiciary. State paid deputies, for example, could be the model certainly, but with that ability to control so as to best ensure that we able to meet our constitutional and statutory responsibilities in terms of ensuring courthouse security. The other thing that just came up was the possibility with section 7, which talks about one minimum deputy by July 1, 2024, whether or not that, again, kind of would suggest a solution, whether or not the report should instead state what would be the deadline and what would be the minimum. So we didn't know if it was maybe a good idea to mold the two for that reason. It just seemed that it might make sense rather than saying you shall by this date, when it may be that the report suggests a different date or a different minimum, that was something that just came up that we wanted to mention.
So I have a couple of hands that have come up with questions. If we can dive into that now. So Representative Morgan, and then I'll go to you, Representative.
Yep, thank you. So in this, Terry or Greg, either one of you, I believe I can read into this to say that this report, when we get it December 1st, would have the one-off for the scenarios like you remember with Grand Isle County, Terry, severe staffing shortages. So we would have an off-ramp, I assume, am I making a correct assumption, off-ramp for a situation like that because they may just plain not have the manpower. I would hope that would be a component of it, yes.
That would be a
Right,
good example. And certainly the judiciary making efforts to ensure that there's courthouse security in whatever form is
Right.
feasible.
That's what I'm getting, like, in this case, I believe, unless somebody changed Grand Isle, still at the moment has, unless Sheriff Alan Heston, that component, I think still has a contracted individual there.
You're
So
right.
we've evolved since that crisis. And for a while, we had our own employee who is a level 2 certified.
Yeah.
Who was in that courthouse for a number of months before we were able to arrange for private security guard.
Yeah.
And now it's supplemented by out-of-county state paid deputies sometimes on a
Okay.
basis.
Okay.
So it's a great example of the flexibility that we have today to try and address the needs of each court so that we can get the hearings and trials moving.
And you would envision that continuing further or forward because, again, you can't have the crystal ball of what every county is going to look like forevermore. We don't, right? I mean, okay, just want to make sure that, I guess, relative assurance was there that that is an option because in a moment's time, you could lose half your staff for whatever reason, you don't know. Okay, thank you.
Representative Hooper.
Good afternoon. When you were doing the rundown of positions, you said you had 40 that were deputies,
Yes.
10 that were private,
Yes.
23 that were something else. Is that where the court officers, do they fall into that or what?
They can. There are 23 state full-time employees. And so they have, they're either court officers or court screeners. So they could get the front door screening. Most often they're court officers in the courtroom.
And they are not sworn in any way, no level.
They're not. We train them to do the work that's provided. But like I said, we do need a law enforcement officer under that roof because when there's an incident, when the judge says, take this person into custody, or when somebody comes into surrender because of an arrest warrant, we'll struggle if we don't have a law enforcement officer.
And Terry, were you sort of advocating for a sheriff's department within your judiciary?
Not a sheriff's department,
Well,
but the state.
somebody that supervises actual deputies.
Yeah,
Right.
advocating is not the right word. It's, a number of our fellow states have judicial marshal services where they have law enforcement that are under the direction of the judiciary. In this state, the state paid deputy transport model is kind of that same model. So it's one of the many options that I think are out there.
We're certainly open to exploring and understanding the need,
Yeah, it's just, that seems to be another hole.
Thanks.
Valley would dig it into.
Sorry, we're just getting noise from the door. Appreciate Tom jumping up there. So,
Just to follow on to what Rep. Hooper asked to you folks. So the court officer, again, I've been to Grand Isle, I keep using, that's the one is my example. So does each court have, because he was talking about the 23 and there's 23 courthouses, you said that court officer in there, or do in some cases they rely on that person also could double as the door guard. It would have to run upstairs potentially, like in the case of Grand Isles Courthouse. If there was a problem and go, I got it, I'm the guy in charge or gal in charge that will take care of that situation. Is that what I'm hearing? Because there, like I know in Grand Isle, I believe there's a gentleman sits in the court when they're there.
Every courthouse does have a screener, and that's the first line of defense because
Sure.
they check for
At
weapons.
the front door essentially.
Right.
Yes.
And then otherwise, if there are hearings in
Yes.
the courthouse, certainly criminal and family hearings.
Yes.
There would be a court
Officer.
security presence in the courtroom, whether it's a sheriff deputy, whether it's, I guess you would know more than.
Yeah, well, for instance, in the example of Grand Isle, oftentimes it's a state pavement, not a county.
Right, that's the gentleman I'm familiar with. Yeah.
The court officer may or may not be a law enforcement, may or may not. So in Grand Isle, I would imagine they generally have hearings on Thursdays. There are times when there are hearings and there might be one officer there, or there might be two, but neither one of them are law enforcement. Certainly in other counties, in our smaller courthouses, there are hearing days where there's one person at the front door. And if there's a problem in the court.
They would have to run up.
They have to lock the front door and then run out.
That's it. Okay.
National best practices has recommended two officers. Yeah.
And I can see that. That's why I'm kind of getting at is there any inherent danger with that not being
We
present?
had a study
You
done.
had an issue.
Yeah, we had the National Center do a study in 2015, so it's dated. And their recommendation was to add 35 positions to court security across the state, which we've never done. We've added one since then.
Yeah.
And so, the question is, do we really need what they're recommending? So for example, they're recommending 3 officers at the screening front door. One to manage the crowd, one to manage the equipment, one to be there in case of an emergency. In Vermont, especially in our smaller courthouses, that does seem to be a bit of overkill.
Yeah, and I can understand that. It's just a fine line of if you had a problem, you want that to make sure that there's a timely response, I guess, is what I would be concerned about.
Exactly.
So as long as we're balancing that, and I get it, it's one of those things, we don't have a gazillion people for these positions to do this stuff, and so, okay, thank you.
So following up on what Representative Morgan said, 23 courthouses, 23 possible court officers, small courthouse example. I spent most of my time in Costello, where it would be the norm to have 3 or more people at the door, plus 3 active courtrooms, probably minimum, with court officers in each one. The math seems to indicate somebody's coming up short on that.
We have 9 courtrooms in Costello.
Yeah,
All, and on certain days, sometimes they're all in use.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that model, we have 1 law enforcement officer in the building, it's a rover. So while he spends most of his time at the front door, he can walk around the building wherever he's needed. So there should be 2 other screeners at that front door. It's one of the more challenging, but there's other tenants in that building as well, and they have security needs that honestly are not addressed by court security. Security that we contract with sheriffs is designed for courthouse. And so when we close at 4:30, sheriff's deputies go away. That's the end of the day. So probation and parole has a 6 o'clock group meeting in a courthouse. There's no security.
Well, BGS would be responsible for.
BGS would be
that security.
responsible for executive branch security. And every building's a little bit different and unique, and so it creates a lot of different unique problems. Everything from the evening or weekend, if the state's attorney wants a weekend, traffic day, that they've done, their traffic holidays, whatever, that can create problems. We've also had situations where DCF case managers will try and have meetings that they know are going to be volatile down near the security in a courtroom space. And if those run past 4:30, we've paid the overtime bill for the sheriff because of DCF meetings. So all sorts of weird things happen. And it's just something that we've managed.
It requires you folks to be good jugglers.
Yeah. And another example of oddities with executive branch sharing is we have court security cameras. And when something happens in the DCF hallway and they want access to the video, they actually have to subpoena us and ask for it. We don't share management of that or the maintenance and the cost of replacement parts. It's a judicial system. In Addison County, sheriff had a camera at the front door. The judiciary has cameras throughout the court area. I think DMV had a camera there for a little while. There were 3 different cameras in the lobby of Addison. Again, just, that's a little bit of government bureaucracy, but it happens.
So my question is kind of similarly related to that, and I think you got at it somewhat in the memo that you had provided us that talked about the different, so I just wanted to be really clear to the committee. So right now, as it stands today, before this language in S-17, there's kind of a spectrum of people providing security at the courthouses. And if I'm understanding your testimony correctly, the court officers who are judiciary employees, most of them are not law enforcement officers, or perhaps not. Then there are per diem and sheriff's deputies who are assigned contracted. And then there's private security. So there's this whole spectrum. I'm wondering how much control you all have through your contracts in terms of the schedule of the deputies who are assigned to you from the sheriff's offices. And if they, when there are those contracts in place, with the current labor market being what it is, are those folks satisfying the hours, the schedule that the judiciary really needs right now? Or is there still a pretty big gap?
I would say there's a bit of a gap because our staffing, 73 FTEs in total, are minimally necessary. So when you get a couple of people calling out or somebody on medical leave, it creates a problem. And so the contracted deputies, the 40 FTEs that are sheriff deputies, generally are full-time positions. We need them at the screening door or courtroom all the time. Where it gets a little more flexible is with private security. We have called them on short notice and said, can you move your trained guy from this court to that court? And sometimes they can help us. Where it really gets to be flexible is our employees. We have 7 employees who are hired to be a statewide resource, and we will call them at 6 in the morning and say, got a call out up here at this court, they have a trial going on. I know you were scheduled in court A, you're going to go to court B. Please get there by 8:30. We'll pay for time travel for them to get there. So, because we have those different groups of employees or our security, we're able to use them differently. We need the 4 deputies in Rutland courthouse all the time, and then when there's a trial, we might want to slide a couple of employees from Addison or Bennington over to Rutland to make sure that trial goes okay. That kind of flexibility happens on a daily basis. We are moving and matching every single day.
Other questions for Terry and Craig? That was very helpful. Thank you both for being with us today. I imagine you might like to stick around and hear some of the subsequent testimony on this issue.
We'd appreciate that very much.
And I see that Judge Zone is on Zoom. I don't know if he would like to testify or just here to listen in.
Right over
I wanted to offer him the opportunity. I didn't think we would have you with us today. Judge Zone is want to ignore.
No, it's my pleasure. For the record, Tom Zone, Chief Superior Judge. I don't have anything to add in addition to what Terry and Greg have presented, but certainly if there's any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Great. Well, thank you for being here and listening in, and really appreciate the dialogue here and trying to sort of get this right, at least head in that direction for the future with this report. So
thank you.
Great. So our next person scheduled to testify on this is Sheriff Anderson. So if you guys want to switch seats here. Thanks for being with us again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. For the record, Mark Anderson, Sheriff of Windham County and President of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. I'm here in the capacity as President of the Sheriff's Association.
So I think I was hoping that you could weigh in on both the language that's in draft 2.2 in regard to the courthouses and more generally looking forward where you see the sheriffs fitting into the provision of courthouse security. And I think we will have time, once we get through these sections, to have you back if you want to talk about other parts of the bill as well today.
Great, thank you. So bottom line up front, we're good with the study. So let's not.
It's a report, it's not a study.
I consider all the same. So thank you for.
They're not all the same in here.
Thank you for. So we support the report. We didn't come to the table at the beginning of this session with any expectation or anticipation that this was going to be part of the discussion. This wasn't our ask. We're not opposed to the ask, it's just it wasn't our ask. And so in working with the judiciary, who's been great partners, we recognize the desire, the need. And so I'd like to speak at least briefly about what is court security to the sheriffs, as well as our law enforcement capacity, because I don't think that's necessarily been covered too much. Court security, or really security in general, we're talking about access control. We're talking about staff protection, whether it's the court staff or it's the judge themselves. And historically, sheriffs in Vermont have provided that service. You heard Mr. Mosley say that the judiciary has been underfunded the 35 positions from the recommendation. And we've seen that. In Windham County, we have the Newfane courthouse, which has the one person at the door, and they're also the court officer and chief ninja, everything else. Whereas at the Bradwell courthouse, we have, I think it's 4 to 5 positions that have to deal with 2 courtrooms running. And well, if someone calls in sick, then where do you pull? So with court security, dealing with that physical access control is one piece. They're a screener, they're monitoring equipment, property coming in. They're making sure that staff are secure. They're making sure doors are secure, and that broad context. There's cameras that are monitored in most courthouses, if not all, and that's security. Deputy sheriffs currently provide that function, but security is different than law enforcement. And so I believe it was about 7 years ago, it was the Chittenden courthouse, there was a sexual assault reported at the courthouse. Law enforcement investigates that, and as to whether that would be the courts, law enforcement deputies, or that is, say, in that case, Burlington Police Department, certainly there's resources to bring in for major crimes. But there are also crimes that our deputies would investigate within the courthouse. And to a degree, there's a concept where the judiciary is going to want to be impartial to the investigation, because they're going to be the same court that is going to be having the hearing when it comes before them. So in our minds, there's a bifurcation in the two systems, court security, law enforcement. We generally can fit both bills, but because of underfunding, chronic underfunding over generations, we have seen struggles among sheriff's offices to be able to satisfy the services needed. And that's where the system of private security officers, state employees who are not related to law enforcement, and then sheriff's deputies have now filled it. What we asked for, if we were compelled to provide court security in each courthouse with one deputy in each courthouse, really what we're asking for is the resources to do it. We have a system which we've demonstrated works, that we can retain people. This is a state transport deputy program. And so that's where we went to say, this is a system that we can deliver that. There are issues, or I shouldn't say issues, hurdles that I think with time and with the correct stakeholders that we can work through those issues. We can talk about the judiciary's need for its control of security in the context of the statutes, but also from a constitutional perspective that they are a separate branch of government. We are concerned if we don't have control of the resources, but we have the responsibility, we are left in a similarly awkward position that we have found ourselves in, where we currently work across multiple segments and we say we're neither fish nor fowl. We don't really belong to the state. We don't really belong to the county. And we're not really sure who the third thing that we work with is, but that's the contracts. So it's just, I think my association's position, aside from supporting the report, is that we want to be active partners for the judiciary. We want the resources to do the job for the judiciary. And at the end of the day, we are supportive of finding solutions to the problem that are simpler, not more complex.
Just quickly, Mark, on the, when you say resources, do you mean physical bodies or are you talking about the money and position?
Fundamentally, it's both. I would articulate that it is the money that brings the bodies, because if I'm not competitive in wage and retirement and healthcare and whatnot, then I can't get the bodies. And that's one of the struggles that some of the departments have identified. If we look to the state transport deputy model, those are consistent positions. We have oversight and management of those positions through the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs, but it's the individual sheriff who's supervising and directing. So we maintain that local relationship with our local courthouses. I've been to my courthouse several times. My deputies are there. We find a lot of benefit. I'm going to use a corporate word, synergy, when we have state transport deputies who interact with court security deputies, because we're able to operate within the constructs of our own policies and procedures. So we can say, hey, deputy needs to go get paperwork from the clerk's office. The person watching the monitor can monitor the person in a holding cell so that they don't, say, hang themselves. I'm not going to trust that to a private security company who I have no relationship with. And so now I need to come up with a new resource to get the paperwork from the clerk's office. So I see a big picture. I see deputy sheriffs doing this. We talked about, you heard that there's resources for best practices. Across the country, sheriff's deputies do serve this function. There's other states where it's the state police who serve this function. There's other states who have judicial marshals, which would be like an analog would be the U.S. Marshals Service, who is the law enforcement arm of the federal judicial branch. We're currently serving this role, but I don't think we creating a separation from or maybe even a marriage between the executive and the judicial branches, that's problematic to us just because it adds more complication how we function.
Thank you.
Representative Hooper.
With your association hat on,
Yes.
you want this job? Or would it be, I mean, it seems to me like we're trying to pound a square peg in a round hole a little bit. And it might make sense to be considering something that's freestanding. So
I think the answer would be yes. I don't think that is a unanimous agreement of the Sheriff's Association. We don't have a position on that per se, and I'd be happy to identify one, which I think we could bring with the report. The sheriffs are already serving this role. And one of the other things when we talk about the personnel filling these positions, the judiciary has been a great partner in teaching our deputies how to operate the various screening machines, metal detectors, x-ray machines, and they have that function. I can teach just about any cop that. Court officers is its own separate skill set. And so whether that is a law enforcement officer or not is a different conversation. Executive protection of a judge is an entirely different skill set. And so we can really quickly branch out and then we say, where do we train these resources? So back to your question, I think there would be a broad support and a majority support to do this. Often the sheriffs who are saying they don't support doing this is because they don't have the resources to do it because they can't hire.
Well, and you brought up the issue of the sexual assault that happened in Costello. I think I was there. It makes clear to me that we have door security and we have courtroom security, but the courthouse is pretty much Wild West.
And that's where we have a position we call a rover. So the rover is basically a roving patrol of the building, staffed areas, public areas, lobbies, bathrooms. That's generally the idea. But if you take the full-time equivalents the judiciary currently has, that's an average of 3 people per courthouse. We already know Costello has more than that. So a report is going to be enlightening, I think.
And I would assume the argument that these should be permanent classified state employees sort of that go to work every day has weight in that discussion.
That would make the most sense to me, is to capture it that way, yes.
Questions for Sheriff Anderson? So I guess I'll just return to where we were at the beginning, is that you are in support, in concert with the judiciary, of having them report back in the context of this bill.
We are in support of that. We are in support of the judiciary conducting the study as opposed to the Department of State Attorneys and Sheriffs. Not to say I speak for the department, but it makes sense to the association that happens as well. There we are.
Well, thanks. We will, I'll invite you to stick around for the rest of this discussion. Did you have another question?
I was just going to make a comment, Mr. Chair. It was interesting. It's kind of a little bit of a funny, but Sheriff Anderson also wove in the other component of his life in the military. He said the bluff, the bottom line up front. That's very interesting to hear. I haven't heard that one in a bit. We use that in military law. This is the bottom line. This is what we're driving to. That was great.
Thank you.
It's the acronyms.
Yeah.
I love it. I just learned a new one.
Yeah, the bluff, the LUF.
Great. So, Steve, are you going to be testifying solo? Okay.
Actually, I'd like to have Vince and Lucy come up with me if that's all right.
That's totally fine with me. Let's have PSEA representatives.
In a past life, I had a great experience of having worked in the Costello Courthouse. So I have some experience, and Vince, in addition to being our lobbyist, is currently the state's attorney in Essex County and spends a great deal of his time in the courthouse. So we have some hands-on experience with how the court security actually works. And I think we'd like to just start by saying that we do support the report that's in Section 7A, but we have some suggestions which we think will make it stronger if you're willing to consider them. First, I would just say that if the importance of the report is really based on who is involved in the conversation. And so our recommendation is that we not just have the judiciary consult with folks, but that they work in conjunction with the folks who actually provide the security and in conjunction with the employees who actually need the security. And so our first suggestion is on line 14 that rather than saying in consultation with, that the judiciary would work in conjunction with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, the VSEA, and the Sheriff's Association. And that, we think, would produce a recommendation to you that would be more representative of all of the folks who have actual experience with security from both the perspective of the management, but also the folks who are the consumers of the security, and also those who would be providing it. And I think it is really important to state that you heard from the Sheriff's Association, you're hearing from the VSEA, we represent the employees in the courthouses. And you heard from the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs when Andy Noonan testified that the model of the state paid deputies is the model that really is favored by at least those three entities. And that really, I think, is important to state. We make a couple of other suggestions based on that testimony that we think would make this section stronger. And that is to insert in the language where it says the number of state deputies, that it be state paid deputies. So on line 17, where it says the committee shall report on the number of, currently it says sheriff's deputies, we think it should say state paid sheriff's deputies. And the same on line 21, we would not support weakening the end of that by removing the word similar to. We think the intent of this section that makes it clear that the model that we're looking at is one of the state paid deputies similar to the existing model that we use for transport. We don't, as we said earlier in our earlier testimony, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here, and we don't need to overly complicate the situation. We already have an overly complicated security apparatus, as you heard, in the courthouses. We have a current bargaining unit chaired by Representative Tom Oliver of state transport deputies. We can build on that model fairly easily. And one thing that I think I would really stress is right now the judiciary contracts for security from another branch of government. The sheriffs are another branch of government. So we are not asking them to do anything different that would in any way change the level of control they would have over the contract that would be in place. The contract would just be streamlined. It would be with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs rather than individual sheriffs. It's still contracting with a different form of government. It doesn't dissipate their power or control at all. And in fact, that is how the model is set up in the statute for the transport deputies. The sheriffs have designated the department to negotiate and to enter into a contract with the various agencies that use the transport deputies. So this is not asking them to do anything different than what they do now with the current deputies, and doesn't dissipate their power in any way from our standpoint. So I don't know, Vince, if you had anything else you'd like to add to that.
Sure. Thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to appear today. To answer the chair's question, I think you asked a question about the contract and who controls, if I understood the question correctly. At the present time, as I was told in the House version of the budget, there's about $6 million appropriated for security. And that's done by contract between the judiciary and 13 sheriff's departments. And so the contract specifies what services will be provided in exchange for X amount of dollars. And that is a contract with the executive, with another department. You know, sheriffs and law enforcement capacity are certainly considered executive branch, and they want law enforcement security. So the judiciary also contracts with the Department of Buildings and General Services for the maintenance in the courthouses. I presume it contracts for IT services. And so there's a lot of precedent for the judiciary entering into contracts with other departments or agencies. But ultimately, the judiciary controls because the contract specifies the obligations of the contractee. And I think that's important to know in support of our position that we would like to transition to 25 state paid deputies to be assigned to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And then that department would contract, as the judiciary does with other agencies and departments of state government, to provide services for security purposes. Now, since the pandemic in Addison County, a state transport deputy has been providing courthouse security. There has been no issue, there has been no problem, there has been no failure to provide that security. And I just want to acknowledge that the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs has assisted the judiciary by assigning a state paid deputy to provide those services. It's been done flawlessly, seamlessly, and I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge, by the way, I meant to say this when I was going to begin my brief remarks, that Annie Noonan did come in. She's the person that oversees that department, and she has made those services available to the judiciary because there was a need there was a resource available, and it was accomplished. No fights, no issues or anything along those lines. And I also want to note, I saw that Judge Zone is on the line, or at least was. He is absolutely loved by the judicial assistants and the staff in the Northeast Kingdom. And it's a working relationship already in progress. The courthouse security, the judicial assistants, all work together. So this is not unprecedented. So that's our point. The contract governs the services to be provided. The judiciary always will be in control because it helps to write and enter into that contract. And so to ensure that that positive working relationship that's already in place with the chief administrative judge, with the court administrator, with the Department of State's attorneys, and with our members be reflected in that study. And so we would urge that you ensure that the Vermont Sheriff's Association, the Vermont State Employees Association, and the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs be made part of that, what you call it, task force or working, I don't know what you're calling it.
We just asked in this language for judiciary to give us a report back.
Right.
So happy to add folks for them to consult with. I
In
think.
consultation with, something like that.
Or in conjunction with.
Yeah,
Or in conjunction with.
I think there's an acknowledgement from the testimony we've heard to answer that question that we're not in a position right now to say in this next fiscal year we're gonna do this whole new way. But that we're looking for more information from those stakeholders
But
ahead of the next session.
they are the stakeholders in place now, seamlessly providing courthouse security, and we think that should be built on and not some new enterprise created. That's it.
Representative Hango has a question.
Thank you. 25 statewide deputies, are they sworn law enforcement officers? I can't even talk today.
Certified by the
your-
Vermont Criminal, what they call it, Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council anymore. It's called the Vermont
Criminal Justice Council.
Criminal Justice Council, yes. And they exercise law enforcement authority, have the power of arrest, and that's why they're clearly an executive branch, that's an executive branch function.
Questions for Steve Rubens? Thank you, gentlemen, very much for your So committee, we have about 15 minutes here before our scheduled break. So I wanted to have a little bit of discussion, take a break. We have scheduled testimony, a walkthrough of the Vermont Saves Bill S-135, and then we're going to come back to the sheriff's bill and talk about some of the ethics sections. So before we move on from the court security sections, I just wanted to get a feel, given the testimony that we've heard both today and previously on these. I want to throw out a couple questions for folks to consider and have a little committee discussion time. So you probably have noticed a theme that as we've gone through these, a couple of the mandates that came over, I want to just make sure that we're being thoughtful about sort of how those will work in reality. And so this Section 7 piece about saying we're going to have one deputy sheriff be at the courts, I think everybody wants to head in that direction. The question is, how do we provide that given that there are various levels of resources throughout the state and that works, that may be working. It may work and be an easy thing to satisfy, but it isn't everywhere else. And then, sort of if there are specific thoughts about exactly what wording we need to see in this report back language. So I'll open it up. Does anyone have questions or strong feelings about updates to the Section 7 and 7A? Representative Hango.
Thanks. 7A, I think, should address something about that funding is provided for this ask. I mean, I don't know where the funding would come from. It does say any corresponding budget request for these positions. So similar to So I think we need to be clear that the report should also report back on where would the money come from to fund these positions.
Yeah, I think the general idea of why there's a report here and not an explicit, we're doing this, is that the memo that we got back from Terry and Greg was that there's patchwork and the money that we budgeted for the security is being spent in a bunch of different ways. And so we don't want to break the thing that isn't giving us all of the courthouse security that we want by mandating a new thing. So we're asking them to give us some more information and be thoughtful over the next few months about how to provide that. I think we could be more explicit about the funding, but I think that's the core issue here is sort of how would we move from the patchwork that we have today that we are spending, $6 million a year on. Is that what would be the right number, and how many of those people that are providing courthouse security need to be more deputies versus, a new officer might be more useful for them in certain instances. We don't really know that, but this idea being laid on the table of using the state transport deputies as a model that we've heard a bunch of times, it seems like before we can make any kind of decision about that, we would need some more information. Senator Waters Evans.
Can you just tell me, like, super simply, just to help me here, what problem are we trying to solve?
So I would say that there's a couple of things. Some courts, from what we've heard from our representatives from the judicial branch, can't operate at certain times or have to do it in a limited or awkward way, like having somebody lock the doors and run up into a courtroom in order to staff it, because we have limited staffing and we've budgeted for pretty limited staffing to provide courthouse security. So what originally came over to us was in this language in section 7, a sheriff shall provide a minimum of one deputy sheriff certified as a law enforcement officer, right? So we've got that sort of like mandate, but then we've also heard from the sheriffs that some places that would be fine, but in other places there isn't any sheriff's deputy right now providing courthouse security, and that would be great if we could find that person, but we would need to figure that out. And so the Senate in S-17 pushed the start date for that mandate out a year to July of 2024.
To do the report?
To actually just have the mandate. But they still didn't address the things that the report's asking, which is, who should these people be? Should they be the sheriff's deputies? And if we went to a model of having them be state employees like the transport deputies, how could that work? And how many deputies would work in that model and fill the gaps? Because what we all want to get to is to have safe courtrooms that are open when they need to be open. So that's the bigger problem that we're trying to solve.
Okay. I mean, that's what I thought was the problem, but it seems to me this might be overly simplistic the way I'm thinking. But I think if you're just asking somebody to do something, you have to give them the money to pay for it, correct? So doesn't it seem like a budget issue more, or like a money thing rather than whatever else all this is, which makes sense, but.
It's the money, but it's also from the testimony we've heard from both the sheriffs and from the court administrator, it's about who do those deputies work for, and are they contracted or are they state employees? And that is a question I don't think this committee has enough information to answer just yet.
That was my next question, which is if it's mandated by the legislature that they hire them, then they would be state employees, because it's not.
No.
It's not a natural.
We just tell the sheriffs, hey, you have to provide a deputy. That's what came over from the Senate. Is starting in July of 2024, you have to provide a deputy for every courthouse. Sounds great on paper, but so what I am trying to take some responsibility for here is to say, actually, let's work with the courts and the department and the sheriffs and the Employees Association and other stakeholders if they want to weigh in here and try to figure this out. So the first step of that was asking the judiciary to work with some of those stakeholders because they volunteered. Thank you very much, Terry, to work this year on a report back for us to help us, because I think we have a direction to point in, but we're just not, we don't have all the information we need to get there. Representative Hango.
Thank you. So building on Representative Waters Evans' question, which was similar to mine, like what about the funding for this? Doesn't this report ask them to do what you're asking us our opinions on right now? I'm not sure what you're asking us for.
I'm asking you if, based on everything you've heard, if this structure, the first question is this structure of saying we're going to delay any implementation of this mandate and ask for a report back, if the committee feels like that's a sensible way to proceed. And then if there are specific questions or other things, like could we be a little more explicit about funding? Sure. About that being an ask. It's like, what would it cost to do this? So with any recommendations you have, just trying to get at that in this language, any corresponding budget requests for these positions was how I and Mr. Devlin tried to capture that. But I just want to make sure that the structure is sort of amenable to the community. Nobody's got any heartburn about sort of doing a feint in this direction, but saying, hey, we need some more information so we can act on this and help support the judiciary security, hopefully in next year's session. Representative Morgan and then Representative Nugent.
On this, so I can see we're going to work on this afternoon and looking to try to mark up a final mark of a potential vote tomorrow morning. I know Sheriff Anderson testified on part of it. Do we want to give him one last crack at it somewhere? Because I think this is new language to him and his peers, correct? Just to go, because I mean, they're the major stakeholder in this, obviously, and I just want to make sure we don't have some unintended consequences. I guess I'm being a little probably over whatever on that, but you know what I mean? Just one last, here's your last word. What do you think?
Yeah, happy to do that. I think what I was hearing loud and clear from Sheriff Anderson, not to put words in his mouth, but to try to summarize, is that there's a sense of relief from the association that we're being thoughtful about this mandate that was included, and that there's the very strong implication that by the time we get to next year, we're going to be looking at this issue more in depth and just saying, you got to put a sheriff in every courthouse. Every courthouse.
Yeah, I just, and then in general, the whole schmear before we go. Yeah, sounds good. Vote. Yep. We're all good.
Oh, yes.
One last cut at him to go, because these guys got to live with it.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other sections that I'd love to hear more from Sheriff Anderson on. I think I mentioned that earlier that we haven't gotten into, so I'm trying to stay focused.
Yeah.
And possible markup and vote tomorrow. we may have more work. Representative Hango, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm still trying to compare the notes that I had questions on with this new draft, because I just saw the new draft when we sat down. And I don't know if all the things that I brought up as questions on Friday were actually addressed in this new draft. So when would we address those, if I find some that have not been addressed?
I would say that I am working and have been all weekend on the notes that I had from our testimony last week. That's what resulted in this draft. I've already received some feedback, both from Sheriff Anderson and from others. And we heard some testimony today that I think might have some tweaks to this section. So it really is, this afternoon and tomorrow morning, I would say if you've got any big burning thing that you want to get into the conversation that we need to look at, sooner is better, because this bill we're going to try to get it into a shape where we can take a vote in the next day or two. And, it'll be the bulk of our work this afternoon, obviously, and tomorrow.
So later this afternoon, if I find that there are things that haven't been addressed in the new draft, bring them up then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And tomorrow we're going to spend some significant work on this bill. So my hope is that we can address any major issues in the next 24 hours and have something we can vote on in the next day or two. Right. Great. Well, then let's take a little break and We will be back here. If everybody here would be ready to go at 2:45, that would be fantastic. So this is a little bit longer than a 15-minute break.